I'm Selena, welcome back to my channel. But look who we have back on my channel! It's Mason, my boyfriend. He, him pronouns.
Hasn't changed.
He's back. And today he is back for a very special video. We are doing a joint review together. I think this is my first joint review. Definitely my first joint review with you. Right?
Is it? I mean, I've definitely been in I've been in your vlogs before.
Yeah, you've told us what you think about books. We haven't done a dedicated review for a book. And today's book that we are going to be doing is a very, very special book. Mason, do you want to tell us about it?
Yeah, so this book ties now for number 1 for my favorite book of all time. So that's really special to me. I've actually been searching for a copy of this book for, like a year now? But it was out of print. But recently it came back into print, and it is Peter Darling by Austen Chant. So the premise of this book, without getting too much into detail, is that rather than being two separate people, Peter Pan is a trans man whose name used to be Wendy Darling, who, as if you've read the original or seen the original movie, that is the main protagonist along with Peter Pan. But in this book, they're the one and the same. And you know, I'm a trans man, so that means a lot to me to see myself reflected in this adaptation or this retelling of a classic fairy tale. It follows Peter's return to Neverland as an adult, and perhaps along the way there is an amorous relationship between Peter and
someone you're not expecting.
Captain Hook.
But this book is mostly about Peter's feelings on coming back to Neverland, what it means to him, what he's running from, etc. It's mainly a character study. I read this book because Mason is absolutely obsessed with it, and he loaned it to me shortly after he read it. I finished it like last week or something.
Something like that.
Last week and a half ago, something like that. And I loved it almost as much as Mason did.
I mean, it's so rare to even find trans books at all, much less adding trans characters and trans representation to something so, like, iconic, because it can be a daunting task in general to take on a story so big, so well known.
Yeah.
And then to queer it, and specifically to make it trans, is a pretty radical move that a lot of authors are afraid to do. So props to Austen Chant for having the confidence and courage to do that, because they definitely pulled it off.
So we are going to do a gushing review for this because we both love this book so much. Like, when I tell you it's going to be a gush review, like, I mean it. Like, there will not be a flaw spoken about in this review because, like,
it has no flaws.
We can't find any. I'm sure, like, every book has flaws, whatever. If it does, we didn't see them.
If you think there's a flaw, you're wrong. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to judge people on this channel.
No, you're not. It's gonna sit right there.
You weren't supposed to see that.
Well, I did.
I guess you are editing this, so.
So we are going to get into the non-spoiler part of the review. There will be a spoiler section at the end because we can't help ourselves. But if you want to hear about an amazing book that we both loved, a trans Peter Pan retelling, keep watching. So what do you want to talk about first?
Oh gosh.
Should we start with the character of Peter because he's kind of the central...
Yeah. So Peter, I mean, I've never actually read the original Peter Pan, but I have seen the Disney movie.
I have.
Yeah, Selena has, so she can comment more on this. But I have seen the Disney movie, and in the Disney movie, Peter's portrayed as kind of like a rascal troublemaker. In Peter Darling, I think Austen Chant takes it one step further and makes Peter, a jerk. Like a bad person. Like, Peter is simply not a good person, but that's okay, because not everybody is a good person. He's very morally gray. And one thing I like about it is the story of Peter Pan and like Neverland is like this idea of never growing up. So even though Peter does come back as a grown-up, he still retains that level of immaturity. Like, don't get me wrong, he's not like childlike still, but I don't think, like, how do I put this? I don't think he's really, what would you say?
Maybe as emotionally mature
I want to emphasize the relationship with Captain Hook. There's nothing weird going on there. He is like, both of them are fully adults.
Fully adults. It's not that Peter acts like a child. He just retains the troublemaking of his child, because that's kind of what he perceives his role as being.
So it's like an adult manifestation of this, like, the blurring of the lines between right and wrong, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. And okay, I have a question for you about that I want to ask, but first I also just want to make clear, because I've read the book and you haven't, like the original tale. Peter is not just simply a rascal, in my opinion. In the original tale, he's actually like Disney kind of Disneyfied the tale in more ways than one, but one of the main ways they did it is that Peter, when you have J.M. Barrie's sort of narration, you see how Peter is kind of conniving and sneaky, and like, I mean, I remember there's one moment in Peter Pan where, like, in the very beginning when he first meets Wendy, Peter, like, he goes on this whole way of manipulating Wendy to come back with him to Neverland. Like, she doesn't come back because she immediately, like, wants to. She's like, oh, what are my family? And then he, like, manipulates her into coming back.
He sort of does that in the movie. But anyways, so what I think you're saying is Disney took all of, like, the manipulative and jerk aspects of Peter Pan and put it in Tinkerbell.
Yeah, Tinkerbell is also a jerk. She's like a big jerk in the books. But they kept that for her. But Peter, I think, is supposed to be a little bit more innocent, or whimsical at least. Whereas he's actually quite. He's kind of a little jerk. He gets violent with his Lost Boys. He becomes very angry and manipulative and possessive over people. So Wendy, all the Lost Boys, he is very, very possessive over them and their lives. And so the way that Peter Darling moves through this book and moves through Neverland as its mind, it resonates with the original book. Like, that is directly pulled and expanded on from the original book, because that is Peter's way of being. But the question I wanted to ask you about Peter and Never Growing Up is, why do you think Austen Chant chose to have Peter come back as an adult? I know, like, there was this romance, but it wasn't just because the romance. But Peter is like the eternal child, the quintessential, like, does not grow up. So what do you think the meaning of having him return to Neverland, not as a kid, how he's supposed to be, but as an adult? Why do you think they did that?
So I guess this might just be my perspective, but I think with trans people, and for me, I'm speaking for trans guys, there's this whole, like, second coming of age that we go through, because we, or at least a lot of us, were conditioned as girls and to participate in girl things growing up, and we have to relearn ourselves and relearn our gender and grow up a whole second time, and come into our own. So I think that possibly is what Austen Chant is doing, is having Peter, as an adult or as an older person, depending on when you find out you're trans, rediscovering himself. I never got the chance to explore my youth in a masculine way. So perhaps Peter is not going back as a boy, but reflecting on experiences that he had as a younger version of himself. And, like, from what I understand in the book, Peter knew he was trans or something along those lines. Like, it's
very early.
But I mean, like, this is back way whenever. What is this, like 1800s when this takes place?
Like, or Victorian era.
Yeah, so obviously there's no, like, concept of being trans, at least as an identity. But yeah, Peter was very assertive in his masculinity. However, as you see in the book, it's the olden times, whenever it is, he was not really given a chance to explore that, because it was so even more socially taboo than it is now. And I mean, even now we can't handle it as a society, because society sucks, but whatever. Once he felt relative freedom from the, like, eyes of people for, various reasons, I think he was reclaiming his boyhood as an adult. So he's not, like, reliving boy experiences in the way, like, he's still a boy, but rather seeing the world through a boy's world through a man's eyes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So he gets to use Neverland as, like, this escapist thing where he's able to be the person and with the form that he wishes, you know? Because I think that's a lot of what Neverland represents.
See, and even though Neverland is an escape, it's also not necessarily a positive thing. Like, it's not in the book. And so I think Peter coming back as an adult is also showing how he has not, like, it's almost like his maturity is somewhat stunted. Like, he has not been able to develop like someone might if they were cis, almost. Like, in his sort of oppressive society. Like, his, I just think that the fact that he still has to turn to Neverland, like, as an escape is not necessarily presented as, like, an amazing, perfect thing. And I think it's really interesting what Austen Chant did with this book.
Oh, yeah.
Really, like, what I think probably what should be the last thing we say about Peter's character is this is a deep, like, character exploration of Peter's mind, his gender, his, like, life and how he moves through the world in Neverland, and what he's using Neverland for, you know? Like, the things that Peter works out with Neverland are just top-notch genius. Yeah. So don't go into this book expecting, like, a lot of amazing plot or whatever. I mean, it is amazing, but don't expect, like, constant action or whatever, even though I do think the pacing is really good for this book. It's not about necessarily a external plot. This is all intrinsic.
Yeah, it's definitely way more of a look at Peter and Hook as well. There is some exploration of Hook's character as well. But yeah, there's not exactly a central plot. There's a few, like, I would say, separate plots that occupy, like, sections of the book at a time. But the plots are there to serve as character studies.
I would say that doesn't mean the pacing is bad, though, because I mean, this is a short little book. It's like, what, 300 pages? And they're tiny?
Let's see.
Like, this is a really small book. This is the size.
It's almost 300 pages, a little under. And, like, this is the size of the print. And, like, for reference, can I take one of these other books, though?
Yeah, here, take, like, a memory called it. This is a regular
This is, like, a regular size book. This is Peter Darling. So it's nice and small and, like, you know, and that's also one of the things about this book that I just can't even emphasize how difficult it is to get such a full picture of these characters in the space that Austen Chant had. I mean, they absolutely, like Selena mentioned, the pacing of it. They nailed the pacing. They put what was relevant in perfectly and wove it together so well. There's nothing in this book that isn't absolutely essential. But it doesn't read just like, it flows still. It's not just everything is kind of like chunky because you have one scene that's like central and then another scene that's central, you know. It's like it progresses really well. Everything, I think, feels earned almost. Like, I feel like we go from scene to scene that are all important, and we're also building these character relationships and these character realizations and moments of just like contemplation, and none of it feels like we've skipped any steps or whatever. It doesn't feel like, wait, 1 second, Peter was thinking this, and now he's changed his tune a little. Like, it never really feels like there wasn't the development necessary for me to buy into the story that's happening. Does that make sense? Because it's a very introspective story, I feel like you have to be really careful to take the reader on the journey inside your characters' minds and make it progress really well. And I really think that Peter Darling has that. It nails that. And I just wanted to emphasize that because I think there's this sense that in order to be a masterpiece, it has to be a longer book with like thousands of little details or whatever. I think that's especially prevalent in the fantasy community, honestly.
Yes.
That idea. But there is something equally, if not more masterful about being able to tell your story in 298 pages, tiny pages, and make it absolute perfection. Because you don't have room for error in a book this size. And sure enough, Austen Chant didn't make one as far as I'm concerned.
I also think it's important to know who this book is going to work for. So if you are someone who loves fantasy and the thing you like to read best, and you don't really like other things, is these really long epic series, maybe like Stormlight, or if you really like Malazan Book of the Fallen, like really long epic series with lots of little details, Wheel of Time, like lots of overarching plots, like grand epic scales with amazing character work, you're not going to get that from Peter Darling. So just, I wouldn't go into it expecting like what you usually expect going into a fantasy. This doesn't succeed because it's trying to be what the fantasy genre like considers a success. More like this is like kind of a low portal fantasy that is character study. The world, while it is whimsical and I think it's a great world to be in, the focus is not world building. And while we do have like a fun pacing and plot, the focus is not like the things we are doing in this world. It's how Peter's feeling.
Yeah, and to clarify, that is not a criticism on Selena's part. She's not saying like, oh, it's missing this. She's saying if that's exactly what you need in a book, it's not in here. I'm saying if you can't read a book without wanting that, then
I would skip this. It's not for you. Like, it's just like, if that's what you want, you're not going to get it from this book, so I would move on to something else. But if you're someone who likes character studies that has fantasy aiding the character study, then I think that you would like this book. So one book I can think of is The Kingdom of Back. If you like The Kingdom of Back, I think you may like this book a lot, because The Kingdom of Back is fantasy, but it uses the fantasy to explore the character that we are following and explore her deep emotions. And the world really is an extension of her emotions. And that's kind of how Peter Darling is, exactly how Peter Darling is. So I think if you were disappointed in that book, I think they're really similar in what they're trying to do. I don't think they're similar in any other way, but I think they're similar in their goal.
Also, just quick disclaimer for as to who this book is not for. It is not a kid's book. If you have children, this is not intended for them. I'm not going to explicitly say why, but
we can say why.
Well, no, I was just saying, you know why, but Selena can say what she wants.
I'm gonna say it because I think some people aren't gonna like this. If you're not into explicit sex scenes, there is one in here, and it's explicit.
Also, don't just have kids read it and skip over that part, because it is adult themes all the way through. Like, not necessarily, not sexual, but there is violence.
There's murder. There's death.
There's really heavy themes. Like, it can, for a small book, it can get really heavy. Not in a way that should discourage you from reading it, but in a really emotionally impactful way. But yeah, it's not something that's going to be accessible to children, even taking out the explicit sex scene. Yeah. So, maybe when they're in their late teens, you can
pass it on.
Yeah.
Why don't we transition to talking about the romance now? Do you have anything to say about the romance? I think that one thing I just want to say really quickly is I started this book. I don't like the romance with the villain trope, and really, this isn't really romance with the villain. It's romance between the villains almost. But I really don't enjoy that. Like, I don't enjoy super antagonistic people who are trying to kill each other or like who hurt each other. I don't necessarily like that in a romance because I do think there's usually a power imbalance. That's not the case here. There's no power imbalance, in my opinion. And I think that I was so unconvinced when I started this book that Hook and Peter I would ever be invested in their relationship. I was like, this is not, how are they going to end up together? Like, what is this? They cannot stand each other. I don't know if I'm going to like this. Austen Chant got me. Like,
they convinced you.
Yes, I think their romance was...
It was exquisite.
Exquisitely done. Just the way that they connect and the way, like, who they are for each other.
It's beautiful is what it is. And they're so, like, complementary in each other's lives. Like Selena was saying with, I think, just now is what you were trying to say with that.
Yeah.
That they just balance each other out so well. And again, this is a short book. So to be able to go from antagonists to somewhat like being convinced that there's somebody like that they're perfect halves for each other, that is an amazing feat on Austen Chant's part, honestly.
I would definitely warn you, if you're not a romance person, I do think it's a big part of this book. I still think the biggest part is the character work, but the romance is a close second. more than the world is, or more than the plot is. It's the romance is next. So just know that if you're not a romance person, that is the main source of plot that you're getting. But I think that it's done so well with the tropes and the connection that is built and the chemistry. I think it's all on point, so it's a good romance. But, and I'm not a romance reader, and I loved it, but I think if you are not a romance reader, just be aware of that and decide whether you want to read a short character study and romance focused book.
And on the other side of that, I am a romance reader, like, frequently. And I will say, if you are a romance reader, it is not a traditional romance. It doesn't read like, your classic contemporary romance. It doesn't have the same, like, I would say it's not as, like, fun. That's not a criticism. It's just not as, like, upbeat as a lot of romance novels, even, like, even not contemporary romance, even, like, historical romance, often tend to be a lot more upbeat and lighthearted. This is not that. It is very much a combination. It is a fantasy-aided romance.
Yeah.
So it is not quite... It's not entirely fantasy. It's not entirely romance. It is a perfect marriage between the two where they work together and they intertwine. But if you feel like you fall solidly into the camp of only fantasy, no romance, or only romance, no fantasy, you're not going to get that from this book. But again, that is not a criticism coming from me, because even as somebody who reads mostly romance without, like, these fantastical elements, even as somebody who's like that, or Selena, even who's somebody who doesn't typically enjoy, romance.
Just romance, yeah.
Yeah, even being those people, we still enjoyed it infinitely.
Oh no, what was I gonna say?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Blooper reel.
Yeah, no, shush while I think. Romance. Peter Darling. Romance. Peter Darling. Oh! I thought of it. Okay, so the romance, I think, is also... The thing that is aiding the romance the most is the character work. So I think the romance can only happen because the character work is allowing it to happen, like the character development. And so really this romance is less about two people getting together and more about two people having, like, character development happen that allows them and, like, leads them to each other.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? This is a very character focused and character driven book, and that includes the romance. Usually romance books can be, like, they can have a lot of, like, external sort of plots happening, like certain situations that you're in together, like a vacation you have to go on together, or an elevator you're stuck in, or whatever, that sort of throws you two together. The thing that's throwing these two together is not an external force, it is an intrinsic character development force. Yes. Do you have anything to say about the trans representation?
I want to save a lot of it for the spoiler section, because I want to get into why this happened. But let me just say briefly that when I finished this book, I started just crying. Selena was on FaceTime with me, she knows. I was just crying because the way that the trans experience was captured made me feel so seen. And that's, I've never been to Neverland or had these fantastical things happen to me. And, it's impressive, I think, that even though there's all of this unfamiliar stuff going on, it still felt so true to the transgender experience. And, really made me, it made me feel like a part of a genre that doesn't usually include me, but at the same time it made me feel a part of reality that doesn't usually include me either. But again, we're not going to get into social dynamics here. How do I put this? It is not necessarily a trans, like, coming of age or coming to terms with transgender stuff. There is elements of that in there, but it's not the focus. And honestly, what I loved about it, it was just the experience of being, which is a really hard thing to capture.
So I think now is probably time for us to transition into spoilers.
Yeah.
Give
me a second.
Okay, thank you for hanging out with us and listening to us gush about this review, or about this book and this review. I hope this encouraged you to pick it up or told you a little bit about it so that you can decide whether you want to pick it up and if it's for you or not. Thank you for watching if you're leaving, And if you're staying, which I imagine most people won't because no one's read this book, it's criminally underrated. Let's get into it.
Okay,
Do you have something to start with?
I'm trying to find a line. You can start.
I don't really know what spoilers I have, other than just, I think that one thing that was really interesting to me was just, so the way that Peter's personality from the original Peter Pan is taken into Peter Darling and then explained through some of the exploration of Peter's gender identity is amazing. Like, for example, there's a moment where like, I think the Fairy Queen or something is questioning why Peter is turning to violence and why he feels the need to keep this war with Hook and the pirates and the Lost Boys, like, going. And he says, like, I'm a boy, like, that's what I do, like, I fight. I'm paraphrasing, but, like, that's what... And just the way that he absorbed these gender roles and took them and ran with them, because that was the best way he knew how to be a boy, was just exquisite. At least that's how I took it. And there's another scene like that. Oh, another thing, Peter Pan, or the original Peter Pan, the Peter Pan in that one does not have a good memory. His memory is the worst. He cannot think of anything. There's a scene where he literally forgets the Darlings while they're flying. And they're flying along, and they will start to drop and, like, almost fall to the ground. And until Peter Pan, like, remembers them and comes back. And he probably has lost however many kids because he didn't remember them in time and come back. So the way that Peter Pan's memory, Peter Darling's memory, is discussed in this book is because he's repressing a lot due to trauma. Right? Like, he's trying not to remember these things. He's trying not to think about these things. And so his memory sucks because he's actively trying not to remember anything. And so the way that those things about Peter were just taken and used and explained so beautifully, amazing.
I'll be honest, I have no idea what you just said. I was looking for the line. But whatever.
You've heard what I just said.
Okay, I'll watch it later when this video goes up. It'll be a surprise to me, too. Can I go to the ending, please?
Yeah, go to the ending.
I have so many thoughts about the ending. Okay, so the premise of the ending is that they go back to the real world together.
Nice!
They decide that they want to leave behind these, like, fantastical versions of themselves and experience each other and their lives in the real world. So they manage to go back, and they wake up next to each other, and just, I want to read some lines from this, because what happens when they go back, Peter is back in his, reality body, the way it looks to the people around him in reality. And so he's nervous because, at this point, Hook does not know that Peter is trans.
True.
Hook does not know. So Peter is afraid.
And it was very interesting that we never had to have a scene where Peter had to warn him or something.
Yeah, I loved that.
Continue.
But, so there's this whole thing where they wake up and Hook starts, like, examining Peter, because they both look a little different, because they're both different versions of themselves. But one part is saying that Peter folded his arms over his chest self-consciously because, in this reality he has breasts, and he's afraid of that. But then Hook just says, after, like, running his thumb across his cheek like this, so sweet, so tender, he just says, "My God, it is you." Like, he recognizes him on sight, does not even question for a second. And
I think that moment was, like, he thought it was, like, too good to be true that, like, Peter would have come back with him. Because, I mean, did anyone think Peter was ever going to leave Neverland? No.
And I just want to read this paragraph, too. It's a short paragraph, don't worry. And this is Peter that the author's talking about. He didn't know what James saw as he studied Peter in silence, equally wide-eyed. Then James smiled. James is Captain Hook. A slow, helpless, affectionate smile, and Peter grinned back. Tears sprang into his eyes, and he let go of James' dressing gown to wipe them away, embarrassed and brilliantly happy. Sorry, I'm terrible at reading things out loud. But it was just, like, the euphoria of acceptance and unconditional acceptance. Like, it was that's part of what made me cry, is just like to have somebody who unquestionably, I mean, it reminded me a lot of a certain somebody else. Are you tearing up?
Who?
You.
No.
But just, I mean, unfortunately for a lot of trans people, they don't get this unconditional acceptance. There always has to be disclaimers.
And Peter never had that before.
Well, of course not. I mean, I don't think Peter was like revealing his true self before.
Well, that's true. That's true. When he tried, he had to immediately put it back.
And then it's just,
don't tell me you have manners in
no,
this
yeah, that's
world.
what I was getting to. Yeah, so yeah, but that's just so sweet. Peter said please at one point, and Hook said, "Don't tell me you have manners in this world. I'll die of shock." Like, it's
That's
just
my favorite line. There were a couple.
there was
other
one.
lines
There was
that
one
were
more that
amazing.
was my favorite line.
There's so many amazing lines throughout it about self and identity and so many things that, like, I think that if you're trans, you will probably relate to the most. But even, like, I related to a lot of them. Like, the idea of, like, feeling that you're not, like, feeling apart from yourself in a way. The way that Austin Chant was able to, like, write lines about that into the book. I wish I'd highlighted them or something. It's not my book, so I can't really, like, highlight, and I hate highlighters anyway. But, like, I wish I could remember those lines and, like, go back to them because they were beautiful.
I found my favorite line. Okay, so Peter is going, like, okay, they go back to James's house. That's where they end up. And, like, obviously there's no food. He's been in Neverland for, like, forever. Not forever, but a while. And so Peter starts climbing a tree to get apples. And James is, like, warning him, like, if you fall, I hope by this point you've realized that I live out in the woods alone. If you fall and hurt yourself, there's no fairy dust to fix you. And Peter says, I'm the spirit of youth and joy, remember? So he's still snarky. And then Cook just goes, you're a grown man and a nuisance. Which is an adorable interaction, first of all. But that one actually got me emotionally, because Hook, I mean, I think that's the first time since I come back that Hook explicitly references to Peter as a man. Not that he didn't see it as that, but that's, like, the first, as far as I remember, verbal confirmation that Hook instinctively knows that Peter is a man. Because, like, one thing that I was thinking when I was reading the scene is, what if Hook doesn't realize how, like, how much this is Peter's identity? What if Hook misunderstands? Because, I mean, transgender wasn't a thing that people thought about.
There's no way of him being like, oh yeah, he's trans.
Yeah,
like,
so I was, worried, like, apprehensive that Hook would think that, Peter was just, a girl playing dress up in Neverland, and that's how that's how Peter would have seen himself, or, I don't want to use the wrong pronouns. But I was just worried that Hook would not fully understand. But the fact that, I mean, we can see that James is just able to, like, look in Peter's, like, soul, almost, to see that it's so apparent to James that that's who Peter is. It just shows, like, a love connection that goes, like, James's understanding goes beyond what the time should allow, because he loves Peter so much. And that's just beautiful to me. Selena's gonna start crying is what's gonna happen.
I'm not gonna start crying.
There are tears in your eyes.
No, there's not.
Yes, there are. I can see them. Okay, she's lying.
No, they're not.
But she always has tears in her eyes, so that's not exactly surprising. She's about to punch me.
No, I'm not. I don't do violence.
But anyway, the ending, like, the entire book is beautiful, but the ending just really ties it all together so perfectly. And yeah, it was an emotional, cathartic experience. One where I'm just like, I was just astounded when I finished it. Like, it's not like there was some great twist or anything necessarily. I mean, there were a few, like, minor twists, but it wasn't because there was, like, this magnificent, unexpected thing that happened in the end. It's because it was so domestic and perfect, and just, it tied it up in a neat little bow, where it made the amazing part of the book, not the fantastical stuff, but the ordinary stuff.
Yes, it made the ordinary magical. Like,
Yes.
Neverland is this sort of magical place, but it's described in kind of a very, like, it's not described in a whimsical way, right? Like, Neverland isn't really whimsical, even though it has mermaids and fairies or everything. It's sort of, you kind of said this, it's sort of described as like a, like, it's not very flowery or whimsical or everything. It's just sort of like reality for him.
It honestly feels dead, is the way I would describe it. It feels
like two-dimensional almost, and that's like not a world building flaw. No, that's how Austen Chant wants it.
Yeah, it feels like the real perspective of it is that it's like a flat place where like, it's not ideal to be there.
Yeah.
I think that's what Austen Chant is trying to get across. Like, even though it's this fantastical, imaginative place, it is more of a curse to be there than anything else.
Yeah, it kind of almost feels like paper dolls or something.
Yeah, and
like
that's
paper city.
And that's the whole thing, because James has this realization in here that everything is fake, essentially, and that they've forgotten reality. It's this whole realization that the lives they've been living out have been devoid of meaning, almost. And that they can't really truly experience themselves in that world. So it's, as far as I know, as far as I'm reading into it, that's how it's intended to be. Yes. I mean, I don't want to necessarily speak to what Austen Chant was intending, because I don't know them.
It feels like
I would love to know them. I would really like to have a conversation with Austen Chant, but
but then also, like, you get to the ending and you're in the real world again, and it is vibrant and three-dimensional. Yes. and vital, and like
it's, I mean, like,
and even just magical.
Even just using that imagery of Peter climbing the tree, like, that's life.
That's life, like, literally.
That, like, a tree is an alive organism. It feels like, look, there is no description to this effect, but when I pictured Neverland, the immediate image put into my head was like this grayish blue place. That do you sort of get that too?
I don't, but I get it. I get why you're saying it. Like, I didn't think of it as that.
To me, it felt like there was a filter on it, almost.
Yeah.
Like, you know, not to mention the forbidden thing, but you know how Twilight. You know how the first Twilight movie is cast in that blue.
But it's a blue filter.
And I'm not talking about, like, this isn't ridiculous in that, like, this. Twilight is ridiculous. But this, it felt like there's a filter on this world where I was looking at it, and it was just overcast, almost.
Yeah, actually, absolutely. And then you get to this, like, sunny...
Yeah, you get into reality, and it's like, it's filled with warmth and sunshine, and I don't know if these words are even used at all in this, but I mean, the fact that it elicits such a similar response from me and Selena, that we both saw, I mean, the bluish gray, you said you didn't quite get that, but the overcast,
I get what you mean, though. I didn't see it as, like, all blue or gray, but I get it. And then the other thing is, like, the fact that living as themselves and living, like, outside of a made-up sort of world, like, truly living, no matter what the complications are, like, the world is hard, like, the whole time they've been sort of convincing themselves they didn't need to go back to the real world. That was a bad place, and this was the good place. And Neverland, I don't think is, I mean, this is a spoiler, but we're in spoilers. Neverland is never trying to keep them there. They're creating it and keeping it alive because they want it, they need it, they think they need it, and then they leave and they like just decide to live out like who they actually are, almost like the people they are on the other side. And it's like, I think it's a big message, just kind of saying that, like, no matter what the problems are, even though it is, like, very easy to say this when you have privilege, like, it is worth it. And even, like, with the apple tree, it's almost like the world was, like, providing for them in a way Neverland never did or could. And so it's just like, even if the world, like, sucks, like, their little space is magical, and who they are and being who they are with each other is, like, a magical experience.
Yeah. And another little point that I want to make, Austen Chant does not try to explain Neverland. This isn't one of those books where, like, their goal is to, like, make Neverland make sense.
No.
You know? I mean, and
And
that's
it shouldn't.
I like that because they're not trying to like reinvent the wheel here. They're not trying to explore beyond what Neverland is. I mean, they just leave Neverland as what it was and they put their own spin on it, but it's not like this is a retelling where everything has to make perfect sense.
Yeah.
Like just because there is a reality doesn't mean that everything is looked through the lens of reality. It lets fantasy stay fantasy. And is so much more focused on the characters that it doesn't matter what Neverland is or why it exists.
Yeah.
It's take it for what it is. It's there. And reality is also there, and take it and run with it.
I think it's also the point of view that's different, really, with that, because Peter Pan is from a point of view, like, you are very much in a third-person omniscient point of view, like, someone else is, it feels like someone else is telling you about Peter and Wendy, and they are. The narrator is giving their own thoughts on everything, and showing you many people in the story, like, when the kids are at Neverland, they flash back to the Darling sometimes, and you see how they are, and the narrator will literally tell you what's up, and it's sad, because it kind of shows you these shots of like darkness, but it also is not in Peter or Wendy or anyone's head truly. It can dip in and out, but Neverland and Peter Darling is seen through Peter and sometimes Hook's eyes. It is their perspective, and so you do get a little bit more of a deeper look into Neverland, but it is still what it is. It's just a different perspective, and same with the real world. Yeah, like, this is not an outsider looking in, like in Peter Pan. You were just seeing things from their perspectives.
Yeah.
We should do final thoughts.
I don't know what final thoughts are.
Just, like, non-spoiler, what do we want to say? Final thoughts to encourage people to read it, or anything. Do you have anything to wrap this up?
This works on levels as a story, a retelling, it can work as a generalized story or as a trans story. It doesn't just occupy one space. Like, this is fundamentally a trans story. Don't get me wrong there. Like, it is about Peter being trans. It would not make sense if Peter were not trans. The representation is amazing and wonderful, but it doesn't just... It's not just a trans story, It goes beyond that, which I love.
It's a very human story.
Yes, it's, what I'm trying to get across is I've said a lot that I relate to the story because I'm trans. I think anybody could relate to it on a lot of levels, like, because you can see, like, also the themes of, like, building up yourself and, like, you as you are versus the you that you create, and that the you as you are is enough, So while that works beautifully for a trans story, it also works beautifully as a story.
Yeah. I think my final thought is really, like, Peter Pan, the original, if you like that book, you need to give this a try, because I like the original, but I loved this. I know if Peter Pan's, like, your favorite book, I think that this does it justice in every way, and it almost feels like they are two sides of the same coin, because Austin Chan does take liberties. Peter Pan feels like the story that is told over, like, at bedtime or something. It feels like the story that is told, and Peter Darling feels like the story that actually happened.
Yeah, it's almost like Peter Pan is the idealized version of, in the same way that Neverland Peter in this book is the idealized version.
Yes, and Peter Darling is where it is at. This is such a freaking good, underrated book.
Yes, so I would just like to say thank you to, I don't know how publishing works, but thank you to whoever managed to get this reprinted, because, oh my god, I spent so much time scouring the internet for one copy of this book when it went out of print, and I found one, and it was a lot of money, and I almost got it. Then I decided it's too much money. Then I went back to look for it, because I'm like, I don't care, I will spend $90 to read this book. And it was gone. It had been sold already on eBay, and I was so sad. I thought I would never get a chance to read this book because it wasn't in Kindle or anything either. And then Selena told me it was coming back in print, and I was worried. I was worried that I had built it all up in my head and then it wouldn't meet expectations because it sounded too good to be true almost. And then I read it. Oh my god, it is beyond my expectations. Like, I had built it up so much in my head. I didn't build it high enough.
Yes!
So anyway,
Ugh.
thank you to whoever made it
Less
happen.
than 3 press. I'm not sure if that is just like Austin Chant and a couple of other people like self-publishing or whether it's just indie press. But
I would also like I would also like to say thank you specifically to Austin Chant. I don't know if they'll ever see this, but if you are seeing it, amazing. Thank you for giving me a book that just hit me so hard, that helped me relate so hard to it, that told Peter's story and my story. Thank you for that, because it was an experience that I don't know if I will ever get to live again.
You got me crying in these chilies tonight.
And I feel God in these chilies tonight.
Okay, anyways. Read this book. I'm sure I'll be talking about it a lot on my channel. A lot. This made it to easily top 3 best books of the year for me. And it's number 1 for Mason. Like, oh my gosh, this book!
Anyway, we need to calm down before we shoot the next video.
We're now at 45 minutes of gush about this book. I will edit this down for your consumption. But thank you for sticking with us, and thank you for listening to us gush, and we will see you next time. Right, Mason?
Yes.
Okay. That was so awkward.
Okay.
Bye.